Our next speakers are going to talk on on-farm stress. We have Dr. Andria Jones-Bitton and Briana Hagen. Dr. Jones-Bitton is a veterinarian, epidemiologist, and associate professor at the Department of Population Medicine at the University of Guelph. Her research passion is epidemiology of mental health in veterinarians, veterinarian students, agriculture producers, as well as continued work in foodborne, waterborne, and zoonotic diseases. She uses mixed research methods to achieve her research objectives. Andria teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in epidemiology and qualitative research methods. Briana is working on her PhD in the Department of Population Medicine at the U of G under the supervision of Andria. Her current research program involves using both quantitative and qualitative research methods to understand mental health and wellness among agriculture producers in Ontario, including stress, anxiety, depression, and help seeking. This is obviously a timely presentation for us as we talk more and more about this in everyday society and how we need to deal with it, and certainly farms are not immune to it. So I'll join them, welcoming them, please.
Can you see me? Right here. Oh, and do you have the...
No? Is this it?
Yes. I wanted to thank Mel and Archie and the organizing committee for inviting us here today. It has been really amazing, frankly, learning about what you're doing, and the innovative aspect of what you're doing is really inspiring. So I think it's great. I was talking with Mark last night, and the passion and the enthusiasm that he has, and that you're all just doing you, and it's great, and I think that's amazing. So thank you for having us here. So we're here to talk about mental health in farming. And when I first, about 2.5 years ago, decided that this was an area I wanted to pursue, I'm a veterinarian and I know lots of farmers and I've seen them struggle, and unfortunately too many stories of farm accidents that probably weren't farm accidents, and I thought, you know what, we really need to be doing something about this. And I spoke to some of my more senior mentors and said, I want to study farming, mental health in farming. And some of the critics, I think was the word we heard yesterday from Bob. I had some critics too, who said, you know, I don't think you really want to talk about mental health in farming. That's not something we talk about. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to do it anyway. So here is what we're going to talk about today. So I'd like you to really think about farming. That's something that probably comes very natural to you. And there's some really terrific aspects of farming, really rewarding aspects. There's also a dark side. And so when we think about all the different types of producers out there and think about some of the stresses they face. So they're experiencing a wide range of occupational stresses, most of which are beyond their control. Right? We've got changing climate, changing government, changing regulations, disease, weather, significant financial burdens, succession planning, just to name a few. And many studies have shown that producers are experiencing higher levels of psychological distress than the general population and have elevated rates of suicide compared to other occupations. And this extends beyond the individual farmer. Right? We know that poor mental health in an individual affects the family as a whole, even more so, I think, in farming, because your family is also your business partner and your employees. So we've got some family-run farms, and we've got the fact that no producer really ever leaves work at the end of the day. And that's just during times of calm. Let's think about during times of agricultural emergency. So the psychological impacts of foot and mouth disease in the United Kingdom and Netherlands in 2001 were really well documented. And so producers in these areas, these are some of the photos that were taken in the aftermath of that outbreak and other outbreaks. Producers in these areas experience post-traumatic stress. So characterized by some by flashbacks, nightmares, complete feelings of loss of hope, loss of control, guilt, anger, and grief. And what makes this seriousness to me even more alarming is the relative uptake of appropriate mental health resources. So even in the aftermath of the foot and mouth disease outbreak, very few producers sought professional help. Any guesses on what percentage of affected producers sought professional help? Throw some numbers out there. I heard 5, I heard 10, I think. Ooh, you're close, gentlemen. I wish I had some candies to throw at you there. So 1.5% of producers whose entire livelihoods and whose animals, who we know they're bonded to, 1.5% sought professional help. So that kind of, to me, makes me wonder. It's getting better. We're talking about it more now. But when I started down this road about 2.5 years ago, it was like, why aren't we talking about this more? And I think it'd be really comforting to think that lack of talk means there actually isn't a problem. And frankly, I think we did that for decades, right? So it'd be comforting to think there's a lack of a problem, but I think we all know that we're wrong in that. So why aren't we talking about mental health in agriculture? Well, for at least historically, there's been an incredible amount of stigma, or at least perceived stigma, around mental health, especially in agriculture, right? We see it's getting better in the general population. But in agriculture, we're talking about a specific culture. You're a culture, you're a community. And so Briana and I have heard people say that they believe other people think that depression and anxiety is a character flaw, and it's due to a poor work ethic. You wouldn't have time to be depressed if you were working harder. And we know that strong work ethic is important to this community. It's important to this culture. And so if you believe that your community thinks of your depression or your anxiety or whatever mental health outcome you're experiencing as a character flaw related to being lazy, well, it's no surprise more people aren't talking about it. And so instead, I think many producers have chosen to struggle in silence, or maybe they confide in a small group of people. Now, again, I think things are improving, and I think that's because we're starting to talk about things more openly. Yeah, me too. You look at the stats, they say 1 in 5 Canadians experiences depression or anxiety. I personally think that's underreported, but that means every single person in this room, if it's not you yourself, it's somebody you know or somebody you're related to that's going through this. So why aren't we talking about it more openly? One of the reasons is we don't know what to say. Right? Mental health makes us feel a little uncomfortable. If somebody had had a heart attack or somebody had broken their leg, we can talk about that. But your depression, ooh. Your anxiety, I'm not sure, right? There's a little bit of discomfort around that. And so I think we've got a problem with mental health literacy, and that's something that we're also trying to work on. We're trying to get people feeling more comfortable about talking about mental health. You don't need to become a counselor or a psychologist, but just being able to talk to a friend or look at a friend and say, you know what, you haven't seemed like yourself lately. Let's chat about it. And so that's one of the things that Briana will be talking about. It's one of the things that we're working on. The other issue is mental health supports are lacking, right? Especially in rural areas where even access to a general practitioner can be difficult. But in addition to this, producers want to talk to people who understand farming. So those producers in the foot and mouth disease outbreak, 1.5% turned to a professional mental health support person. Who do you think they turned to if they weren't turning to a professional? Shout it out. Suppliers. Exactly, suppliers. You're good. Briana, step down. This guy can come up. Yeah, so if they weren't turning to mental health professionals, who did they turn to? First, they turned to their family and friends, right? Many of them were going through the same thing. Then who did they turn to? They turned to the suppliers, or the feed guys, or the seed guys, or girls, or veterinarians. And while those people wanted to help, they said, I don't know how to help them. That's not what I'm trained in, right? I want to help, but I don't know what to say. And so largely, again, we've got this problem with mental health illiteracy. So every commodity has its challenges, right? And we could play that bizarre game where we boast about who has it worse, but every commodity has its challenges. So swine producers, there's fluctuating prices and porcine epidemic diarrhea virus. Cattle, we've got prices and BSE and TB. And yes, even supply managed commodities still experience issues. So dairy cow, trade, supply, we could go through this list, right? Every commodity is experiencing its own challenges and issues of farm safety. And then there's you guys, right? The innovators. And what was neat to me and sad to me at the same time over yesterday and today is hearing about, I'm doing this and my neighbors are laughing at me. Right? I think it's fabulous that you're like, I don't care. I'm going to keep going, right? So there's, even within your innovator group, there's unique challenges that you're experiencing. And Briana got some insights on those as well. So we've got challenges in all commodities, and then we have the really big disasters. Rick, I'm really sorry. I have no idea how that picture got in there. So about 2.5 years ago, I went to the literature and I said, what do we know about mental health in Canadian farmers? And I was surprised that there was very little there. And so I thought, well, let's figure out what's there. And so we started a national survey. And this was meant to be a small pilot study just to see if our methods worked. And it was going to be Ontario livestock producers, because again, I'm a vet and those are the producers I've historically worked with. And we started it at the Outdoor Farm Show. And we thought it would be a small, tidy little study. And the survey software that we use, it can't track who's responding or where they are, but generally speaking, we can get a province, right? And so we quickly found that there were producers outside of Ontario trying to take this survey. And there were producers who weren't livestock producers who were trying to take this survey. And that told us, aha, this is something that people want to talk about. And so we quickly got our ethics approval extended, and we went national with it. So we set out to determine what's the prevalence of perceived stress, of depression, anxiety, burnout, resilience. We also wanted to explore help-seeking behaviors. So if you're struggling, are you talking to somebody about it? Are you seeking help? If you are, how did you find that experience to be? If you're not, what are the motivations and barriers to that? And so we ran this from September 2015 to January 2016. And largely, our anecdotal stories and our concerns were confirmed, right? So when we looked at stress, all of these are validated psychometric tools. You answer a series of questions, you get a score, and then you're kind of classified, right? So I like to joke, ladies, it's kind of like a Cosmo quiz, only way less sexy, right? Okay, and so we've got high stress. So 45% of our producers had high stress, right? Here's the problem with the word stress. I don't think it means anything anymore, right? I'm stressed, you're stressed, he's stressed, she's stressed, we're all stressed. Worse, I think some people wear it as a badge of honor, right? We need to remember that stress is associated with procrastination, decreased quality of life, heart disease, decreased productivity, and death. Death, people, and we're wearing it as a badge of honor, right? So we need to remember there's good stress and there's bad stress. So here's a graph. So here we've got performance. So this is peak performance up here, and here we've got stress level on the x-axis. Here's where we want to be. This is a healthy level of stress. When we have a healthy level of stress, we're focused, we're motivated, right? Sometimes you need that kick, you need that push to keep going. Too little stress, also bad. Too little stress, you see it's associated with poor performance here. We're inactive, we're bored, we're not really doing much. The problem is way too many of us are living out here in this red zone, where we're experiencing fatigue and exhaustion and panic and anxiety and anger. And if we let that go too long, we're experiencing burnout and breakdown. And so you think, I'm so stressed, right? It's badge of honor, I'm stressed. It's because I'm productive. It's because I'm working hard. I'm just gonna keep pushing through it, and I'm gonna keep working and keep being productive. No, you're not. High stress is associated with poorer performance, right? We, as a whole society, we need to make some changes because way too many of us are out here, and we should be up here. So that's part of what we're looking at, is how can we help farmers live up here in this yellow zone versus the red zone. So Briana's going to talk to you a little bit about the results that she's found associated with stress.
Right. So we knew that 45% of producers were indicating that they had high levels of stress. So the next step we wanted to take was to look at, okay, what's impacting that stress? What's making people more stressed or less stressed? So we looked at a ton of variables that we had collected in the survey, including some demographic ones like the age of the producer, gender, what commodity they were a part of, their relationship status, how much financial strain they were under. And then we also looked at things like their self-rated health, their self-rated mental health, and then the other mental health outcomes that we were looking at, like resilience and anxiety and depression. And what we found was that as financial strain increased, lo and behold, stress significantly increased for producers. And as dissatisfaction of perceived lack of support from their family and dissatisfaction with the lack of support from the industry itself, stress increased significantly. So that's something that we need to consider. Like Andria mentioned before, when we were preparing for speaking with you guys, we also talked to some innovative farmers themselves to talk about what impacts their stress. And related to some of these variables, some innovative farmers said, should I take that? One said, when being innovative, you try new things. As much as you try to mitigate the risks, you can't help but have a few failures. These failures cost money, sometimes a lot. You tend to look around you, especially after a failure, and witness other farmers who are seemingly more successful than you. So you can imagine how that might impact somebody's level of stress. Another farmer said, commodity prices are always a concern. The unknown risks associated with experimenting or being innovative, financial investment, and the return on investment can sometimes be stressful too. And a third innovator said, your decisions dictate success or failure. So you can imagine how that might impact someone's stress level. When considering support from community and family, one innovator said, everyone's watching. No one wants to fall behind. Everyone wants to outpace the competition. An innovative man who decides to visit the local coffee shop and is inundated with ridicule and laughter can go home destroyed, questioning his very existence. Another said, there can also be a bit of resentment in the community. And I'm not sure if it's real or imagined, but you get the sense sometimes that other farmers nearby want you to fail. So you can see how this would significantly impact a producer's level of stress. And you can see how speaking with people and hearing their stories can show why some of those relationships that we find in the statistics are there and why they're important. So there are a few more factors that were associated with stress from the survey, including farming pigs. Farming pigs was actually the only commodity that, when accounting for all other variables that were associated with stress, came through as statistically associated with high stress. That is not to say that other commodities are not stressful, but there's something about the pigs that we need to talk about. As an individual producer's level of resilience increased, their perceived level of stress decreased, which is a good thing. Because we're going to talk about resilience a bit more later, but we can teach that. So this is a good thing. And then the interaction between anxiety and depression significantly impacted the level of perceived stress. And we talked to innovators about that too. And one of them said, you begin to doubt yourself and wonder if you and your family would be better off if you just did things like a regular farmer. But you can't, because you know you'd never be happy farming if you weren't pushing those boundaries. It's a lot of mental push and pull.
We want to thank the innovators who shared those stories with us. We think it's really important because you, again, are a unique community. So one of the other things that we looked at was depression and anxiety. And again, this was done using a well-validated, standardized psychometric tool. And what we found was, so we added up all the scores for each individual person, and then you can classify them into groups. And we found that nearly 60%, 58% of producers who responded to the survey, this is over 1,100 producers across the country, all commodity groups represented, nearly 60% of them met the scale's definition for anxiety caseness, is what it's called. Because it's not a diagnostic tool, right? We can't do a quiz to figure out if you have a diagnosis of anxiety, but it's a screening tool, so it can point us in the right direction. So when we break that down, 25% in the mild anxiety caseness category, 25% in moderate, 8% in severe. And when we look at depression, we see 35% of our producers met the scale's caseness definition for depression. Again, 20% mild, 12% moderate, and 3% severe. So we're seeing levels there, 35%. If we think about the 1 in 5 rough guide for Canadians in general, we see 35% is higher than 20%. So also interesting for these scales, so both the scores themselves, so the scores that were tallied up for all of the producers, and these percentages, this 58% and this 35%, both the scores themselves and those proportions were higher for our Canadian farmers than they were for farmers that were explored using the exact same scale in Norway and the UK. Now, there were some time differences there, so that could be that just stress, anxiety, and depression is getting worse with time, or it could be that our Canadian producers are experiencing higher levels compared to those other groups. There's also burnout. So one of the other outcomes we looked at was burnout. We measured this using the Maslow burnout inventory. Again, it's a standardized tool. It has 3 components. So the first is professional efficacy. So this is our belief that we can continue to be effective in our jobs, right? So how much you believe you can continue to be effective in your farming. And it's a relatively good news scenario. Only 18% were in the low category. Not so great if you're one of those 18%, but we were pleasantly surprised that it was a low proportion. The second component of burnout is high emotional exhaustion, right? So just feeling emotionally drained and distanced from your work. And we see that 38% of our producers were in that high emotional exhaustion category. The last one is cynicism. So here we saw, there's giggles with cynicism every time. So here we saw that 43% of producers were in the high cynicism category. And usually somebody asks me if I didn't get my math wrong because they expected that to be higher, right? So we've got some low professional efficacy. We've got high emotional exhaustion, so over a third in that category. A further 20% scored moderately high in emotional exhaustion. So more than half of our producers were moderately to highly emotionally exhausted. 43% in high cynicism, a further 28% in the moderate category. So we're scoring high on 2 of the 3 components of burnout. Burnout hasn't been well studied in farmers. It's one of the things that my team is looking at. But burnout in other occupations, well, it impacts your personal well-being, it impacts your productivity, and it impacts your production. Burnout's also been shown to have a negative impact on job retention. When people are burnt out, they leave the occupation. And so my concern is if this trend continues, will we see people leaving farming? And Briana and I have spoken with younger farmers who are supposed to be taking the farm over from their parents who are saying, you know what, I don't know if I want this kind of life. I've watched my parents for years, for decades, struggle. I've watched them be stressed, and I don't know if I want that. So what if there was something we could do to help, right? All of that's pretty dark. So there's this concept of resilience. And resilience is a state of being that promotes feeling good, right? It promotes well-being, and it decreases the impacts of stress. Sadly, we can't do anything about the weather, although you're doing some innovative things to decrease the impacts of weather. But we can't do anything about the weather. We can barely do anything about the government. Can't do much about many of the stresses that you're experiencing. But what we can do is teach resilience. So resilience helps you bounce back from that stress, right? So I like to think of it as a tennis ball. If I was holding a tennis ball and I apply stress or pressure to that tennis ball, the tennis ball reacts, right? It caves in. And then when I let go, or if I lighten it even a little bit, that tennis ball bounces back, right? That's what resilience is. We are humans. We are meant to react to stress, right? That water off the duck's back, it's not really true. We're humans. We're meant to respond to that stress, but we need to bounce back from that. So if I bounce that tennis ball after that stress, resilience is that tennis ball bounces higher, right? So what doesn't kill you makes you stronger kind of thinking. When I started this work, I thought producers are going to score off the charts on resilience. I think I'm going to see high stress, I'm going to see depression, I'm going to see anxiety, maybe I'll see burnout, but resilience, no problem. They're going to score off the charts on this. My problem was I didn't think about what resilience truly was. So here's a graph of our results from resilience. On the y-axis here, we've got percent. On the x-axis here, we've got resilience score. Ranges from 0 to 100. Higher scores mean more resilience. That's a good thing. So this scale was developed in the US. They used thousands and thousands of individuals from the general population to determine what's normal, right? And so the US general population on average has a score just above 80. I should point out this was pre-Trump. Okay. Okay. And so when I looked at the results from our producers, our producers on average scored just about 70. So 2/3 of our producers were lower in resilience than the US general population. Which occupation can you think of that experiences a high number of stresses completely outside of your control? Right? It's you guys. So if anybody needs hot, strong resilience, it's the people who are experiencing massive levels of stress that they can't control. Some occupations have a little bit easier. We all have stress, no doubt. But some of those things we actually have control over. So we need to be focusing on occupations that have stress that they have little control over. What you can control is your resilience. So resilience, unlike just like, I guess, Maybelline, you don't have to be born with resilience, right? You can develop it. And so here are some of the quotes that we shared from our national survey. So these are your fellow producers. We're not invincible, but we feel we must be. I was incredibly upset with myself that day for not being on top of things. I'm pulled in multiple directions and unable to maintain work-life balance, being exhausted but unable to take a break. I'm destroying myself to make sure others are cared for. The main stress in my life, feeling ignored and marginalized by our government and our society. What makes me the most upset is I have everything I've ever dreamed of, love, family, and a farm. And all I feel is overwhelmed, out of control, and sad. I just try to keep plugging along until death. Right? Yeah, so where's the resilience there? It's quality of life. Chronic stress and burnout affects our quality of life. It's a wonder we don't off ourselves more often. So, Briana's going to talk to you a bit about her results from looking at risk factors associated with resilience.
Yeah, so like Andria said, we found that our producers were scoring an average a little bit lower, or I think it was 10 points lower than the US general population. And to be clear, that survey happened pre-Trump as well for our producers. So they were already scoring 10 points lower. But we looked at those same variables that I talked about when we were looking at stress, but what came out was different than the factors that are associated with stress. There were different ones that were associated with resilience. So here, producers who rated their own health as excellent were far more likely to be resilient than even those who rated their health as good or fair or poor. The odds of being resilient were significantly higher for producers that felt supported by their friends. If you remember in the stress results, people who felt lack of support from their family and from the industry had high levels of stress. And in resilience, people who felt support of their friends were more likely to be resilient. And as age increased, resilience increased as well. The odds of being resilient increased as well. So what did innovators have to say about this? I believe I'm just simply wired to be an innovative farmer. It's just something inside me that always wants to improve upon what we are already doing. Another said, watching my father farm as a young man gave me my love and drive for innovation. He was always on the cutting edge, always changing, modifying, and running the numbers. I guess first off, I love that I have the ability to continue that tradition and pass the never-ceasing qualities to my children. The ability to manipulate my farm's success with my own ingenuity, my own two hands, my level of smarts, is a high only a business owner could experience. It provides satisfaction and, above all, a sense of purpose. When talking about supports, one innovator said, "It is still difficult for people to admit they need help. At the end of the day, we can't be all things to everyone all of the time. For most businesses, they have an HR, finance, operations department, yet on many family farms, the producer is all of those things. It is difficult to ask for help." So, there's some good news here as well. Some of what we're talking about is a little bit heavy, but to share some of the good news, 3/4 of the producers who took part in our survey indicated that a mental health professional is someone who would be helpful in times of struggling with your mental health. 67% said that they would seek professional help if it was available, and 63% said that getting help for a mental health struggle doesn't mean that you're weak. So those are things that are good and that we can build upon and do a bit better. So what exactly are we doing? We're trying to capitalize on those things. So phase 2 of our project is building, whoa, that's a big picture of me. I did not put that in there. So building on the first phase of the project, we're now, okay, we know where we're at, so now what? We are talking to producers, veterinarians, government, and industry staff who work in agriculture to talk about their lived experience in terms of their mental wellness, mental health on the farm, help-seeking behavior, what supports are currently available, are they good, what could be better, how can we improve, through one-on-one in-depth interviews. So I've been doing those for the last 7 months, and I've spoken to just about 70 producers in depth about this. So things that have come out of this indicated that, okay, Andria touched on mental health literacy earlier. Maybe that's a really good place for us to start. Maybe we can build some mental health literacy in the agriculture community. So if you don't mind going to the next slide.
My apologies.
Thanks. So for those of you who might not be super familiar with mental health literacy, it is something that we can teach, and basically we're giving people a toolkit to be able to know a little bit more about mental health and wellness, know how to identify when someone or even yourself might be struggling a little bit with mental health or a lot, and know how to be comfortable and confident in having a conversation about it and be appropriate in that conversation and guide people to the resources that are available. It is not, like Andrea said, we are not proposing that everyone should be a counselor or everyone should be a psychiatrist. It is just giving people the ability to be confident and have appropriate conversations about mental health. So increasing knowledge, improving attitudes, and stimulate helping behaviors and confidence. So we heard across the board of interviews that this would be a good thing for agriculture. So then we brought it to our stakeholder working group meeting. Here's some of our wonderful stakeholders working super hard. And we said, okay, let's talk about mental health literacy in agriculture and brainstorming what that might look like and if we need it. These are the notes that came out of that meeting. We had a graphic note taker, and it was a wonderful way to capture what we talked about. And I don't have a microphone on, so I'll stay here. But there were 3 main, does this have a laser? Okie dokie. Woo. Okay, so there were 3 broad topics that we talked about when discussing mental health literacy in agriculture. The first one over here is, do we need one? There are programs that currently exist for the general population. Can we use that, or do we need to develop something that's specific to the agriculture community? the answer to that question was, heck yeah, we need one, and heck yeah, it needs to be specific to the agricultural community. Specifically, there were 4 points that were brought up. One being isolation. We can't be isolating a part of the community that by developing something that is completely unrelatable to agriculture. The program needs to be relatable to everyday life in agriculture, or as one of our members said, I don't think you can see it here, but this cannot be something that's too airy-fairy or it is not going to work in agriculture. The examples and information need to be reflective of everyday life. And the other point was that we need to recognize the uniqueness of the farming occupation itself. This intersect of home, business, and history or connection to the land. For example, you can't just leave your work at work and go home and rail on your coworkers and talk about how horrible your employees were that day, because they are likely sitting there with you at your kitchen table and may not appreciate it. So we need to do a good job of that, or it's not going to be helpful. The next thing we talked about is, okay, we need a mental health literacy for agriculture. Who needs it? Who needs this type of training? The response was everybody, which I tend to agree. However, then we switched the question to, okay, but then who first? Where do we start? Where can we start? And there was discussion about, okay, what if we start by training people who are veterinarians that work, who are the crop specialists who come in, who are the industry reps that visit the farm, people who work very regularly with producers, who are kind of those helpers that Andria was speaking about when talking about the foot and mouth crisis, the people who are being sought out for help. What if we can arm them with a toolkit to be able to have these conversations appropriately and confidently first? What if we start there? So that's something that we're exploring. And the other thing that was highlighted was we also need to get this training available to all the producers, because they also need to be trained in mental health literacy. This is something that becomes logistically a little bit more challenging because, unlike today, we don't tend to get this many farmers in one room for a big amount of time to deliver this type of training. So how do we do that was the last piece of the conversation that we had. Who will deliver it and how will they deliver it? And basically what we've decided is that it needs to be multimodal. So we're developing an online training, and we're developing an in-person training, and we're developing 2 types of training, one that's short and condensed and one that is a bit longer, to try and make something available to everyone. Some people really enjoy learning in a group environment and would benefit most from that. Other people would prefer the anonymity of doing something online, or it's much more conducive to their schedule. And lastly, we talked about how this type of training needs to be delivered by somebody who has a background in agriculture, but also has the background in mental health and wellness. And then give this back to you.
It was, no, I won't go there. Okay. And so all of this, again, is to look at, and then what, right? So what do we do to help support our farmers? And so the initial funder who readily came on board, and we're incredibly grateful for that, was the OMAFRA U of G agreement in emergency management. Because what we heard from producers and vets and people who were on the ground during animal disease outbreaks was, I felt like we were really quick to contain disease spread, right? Which is great, we need that. So we were really quick to contain disease spread. We were really quick to figure out what's the most humane way of depopulating a barn, for example. But it almost seemed like the mental health of the producers in that experience was an afterthought. And so what we want to do is come up with a model for resources for what is it that we can do to support producers during this time. And we've also extended this to go beyond the emergency and also look at during times of relative calm. So what is it that we can start to develop for producers so that we can help them with the stress that they're experiencing and help them increase their resilience? And I think it's obvious to everybody in the room why this should matter. Right? If our producers are struggling, they're experiencing distress, even if they're not always talking about it. And it's that reality that's led to some terrific programs, for example, in Australia, where they are looking at both physical and mental health of farmers, and they're creating programs to help them through that. Canada's behind on that front, and that's a gap that we want to address. When we are not performing optimally, either physically or mentally, it affects our productivity. When we're experiencing high stress, it affects our productivity, and this is true of farmers as well. So mental ill health affects our farmers, it affects their animals, it affects their production, and it affects their financial bottom lines. We also need to consider, if for those of you who might have animals in the room, livestock, we also need to consider the impacts of producer mental health on the care of their animals. So when we are unable to care for ourselves, it becomes very difficult to care for others, even when that is so important to us. And so there are animal welfare implications, actual animal welfare implications, not the ones that PETA pretends that are there, but actual animal welfare implications associated with producer stress, depression, anxiety, and burnout. And when we see major animal welfare events and legal cases, this isn't an evil producer who was doing bad to their animals. In almost every instance, this is a producer who was struggling, and people didn't realize it, and he or she was unable to care for their animals. And so all of that speaks to why we should care. So we're putting together these mental health resources, and then we also want to look down the road at building resilience training programs. So how can we help producers build up their resilience? So in summary, the national survey suggested that many of our producers are struggling, even if they're not talking about it. There's an opportunity for us there to improve our resilience, to improve self-care strategies, to build up resilient skills. We need to arm people in this community with the skills that they need to talk about mental health and to help bridge people to appropriate supports. Still working on decreasing stigma, if that still exists. Again, I like to think we've evolved there. And then all of this will lead to improved personal and professional productivity, and that really can only lead to a stronger agricultural sector. So we wanted to thank the participating producers, those that have been in the national survey, those that are speaking to Briana in her research interviews, the innovators who shared their stories with us for the talk today, the many multiple agricultural and vet groups that assisted with recruitment, our fabulous stakeholder working group. We're all in this together. If you've got a passion for this area and would like to join our team, please just chat with Briana or I. We'd be happy to have you. And Phase 2 funding has been provided by these sponsors. So overall, we believe that we can be doing more for our producers, for our ag community. And again, if you feel the same and want to come on board, please feel free to chat with us. Thank you very much for your time today, and if you have any questions, we'd love to try to answer them.
Thank you very much. I do have a question off the start here, and I'll read it here so I get it right. Fall is generally a busy and often stressful time of year. Do you have any indication how time of year impacts scores in mental health?
Did you?
So I can speak to the qualitative data that I collected. With the survey data, we did that in a cross-sectional approach. So we didn't have follow-up at certain times of year, but man, that would be a cool thing to do in the future. But qualitatively, in those one-on-one interviews, yeah, we have a lot of data that we're going to be analyzing that speaks to exactly that, times of stress based on this season.
And that's very likely to differ by commodity group. So you might be experiencing your high stress in the fall. Lambing would be experiencing it in the spring when we've got spring lambing going on. And so it's likely to be very dependent on the commodity group as well. And so that's where drawing on some of those resilience skills to get you through those difficult periods where you know, okay, it's coming up to fall. I know that the stress is going to increase. What's my plan for what I'm going to do to help address my wellness so that I don't continually get knocked down by that stress.
And I was just going to say, and I also think there's some work there to be done with the commodity groups themselves, with these resources that are being developed, being able to work with them to make sure that those resources are readily available in those times based on the commodity.
Super. And this is a very good question as well. So within this group, with a lot of the innovative farmers would use no-till cover crops, things like that to increase their soil's resiliency. Do you have any tips for us building our own personal resiliency?
That's a great question. So I mentioned a little bit about the program going on in Australia. So there's a fabulous woman there named Susan Brumby, and she is also a lover of agriculture, and so she started the National Center for Farmer Health. And so it looks at both physical and mental health. And this woman, I want to get her here because she's teaching farmers how to build their resilience, and she can get a group of people like y'all here laying on the floor doing yoga.
Anyone want to try?
So, do you have to become a Buddhist master or meditation master to do yoga? No, but there are some skills. So, mindfulness meditation, for example, it has been hugely studied. There's over 18,000 studies of this. So, this is evidence-based. This is not airy-fairy stuff. So, mindfulness is, I would say, one of the strongest, well-supported ways to increase resilience. I'm not affiliated with the app at all. I'm not making any money for saying this. I personally use the Headspace app. You can put it on your phones. It's a great app. The guy's British and he's just kind of dreamy to listen to. And he can walk you through some mindfulness. Exercise. I know that I don't. You might have physical jobs, but exercise is actually the gold standard. So when we look at antidepressants and anti-anxieties, what those pills are being compared to is exercise. Right? So regular exercise where we're getting our hearts pumping and we're moving. Exercise is one other way to increase your resilience. And then self-care strategies, right? What is it? There's 8 domains of wellness. So picking an area for like emotional, for example, occupational, intellectual. Intellectual isn't sitting down studying books. It's doing a jigsaw puzzle or doing a crossword puzzle or doing things like that. So it's the little things. Self-care doesn't mean like Netflix and bubble bath all the time. Self-care is usually, it involves work. And so exercise is work, mindfulness is work, but the studies, at least so far, are showing that the benefits that come out of it are huge.
And changing self-talk is another one that has been studied as well, and it kind of branches off of the mindfulness, but there's a lot of work being done looking at self-talk and how you can improve your resilience with self-talk.
Does that answer the question?
It answers it very well. You know, one thing I think it's a little ironic, as we've worked to more automation and efficiencies in our operations, we've probably reduced a lot of physical labor that happens within those operations, and it creates a new challenge for stress that we probably didn't have, certainly an unintended consequence, I would say. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other questions from the floor? Okay. With that, I want to thank our speakers for an excellent presentation. It's something we can use today, tomorrow, and from here forward. Thank you.